tonight. Very pleased to have Dr. Cherstin Lyon here with us. She's currently professor of history and director of the Honors College at Southern Oregon University. She received her PhD from the University of Arizona here in Tucson, with her dissertation research focused specifically on tonight's topic, so she knows it well. She's the author of several books and articles on Japanese Americans, public history, and citizenship. And the most relevant to a presentation tonight is her book, Prisons and Patriots. This one right here, which, let's see, there we go. Which I think is just a terrific book, and I highly recommend it. Anybody wants to learn more about this, it's just really good. And I really like the cover illustration, which that has a line drawing of the prison camp on Mount Lemmon from a 1944 newsletter. It's one of my favorites, as any of you went on a field trip there last winter knows. So her book and her talk tonight focus largely on the experiences of the Tucsonians, the Japanese Americans who were sentenced to terms at the federal prison camp in the Catalina Mountains. I'd like to add a little brief word of explanation of how Cherstin came to be tonight's speaker. And those of you that have listened to Old Pueblo Third Thursday talks recently may have heard me talk about the building of the Catalina Highway and the prison camp that was established specifically to provide the labor for the highway construction. And I only briefly had time to mention Gordon Hirabayashi, who's easily the most famous prisoner at the camp, and the Tucsonians during World War II. But many people indicated they'd like to hear more about that, and Al asked me to recommend a speaker, and I immediately thought of Cherstin, and now here she is. So please join me in welcoming tonight's speaker, Dr. Cherstin Lyon.
Thank you very much. It's quite an honor and a pleasure to be here. I really appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to join you all this evening. I'm going to share my screen now. I have some slides to share. Whoops. So as Bill said, my presentation title is The Wartime Resisters of Conscience at the Catalina Federal Honor Camp at Mount Lemmon. And I got my opportunity to do research when I was invited to interview some of the resistors in 1999 by Mary Farrell, who was then the archaeologist for the Coronado National Forest. And from there, my research took off, and I was able to turn that into my dissertation and then into a book. So it's quite a pleasure to be able to share some of my research with you. My focus is really to talk about the people who built the highway, the people who were in the prison camp during World War II. And I'm going to share a little bit more than just about the Tucsonians and Gordon Hirabayashi, but my focus really will be on Gordon Hirabayashi's story because I think it's so fascinating. And so much of his story has not really been shared very widely. So as you know from Bill's presentation earlier, November 19th, you know that the construction of the highway was made possible through a collaborative effort between the Bureau of Prisons and the Bureau of Public Roads and the Arizona Highway Commission. Trustees were the ones who built the highway. And this was a new kind of endeavor. It was something that was developed in the 19-teens and 1920s. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. In 1933, construction of the new highway began. And it wasn't until 1939 that the actual prison was built so that it could permanently house inmates to build the road. So the prison was a part of a deliberate movement to provide trustee prisoners. Those were people who had earned the right of trustee status by performing good behavior in prison and who had short prison sentences. This was a deliberate attempt to provide them with meaningful work and to rehabilitate them through meaningful work before they re-entered free society. So during the progressive 19-teens and 1920s, prisons started reforming and new ideas started developing. And by the 1920s, the Western states, particularly Colorado, were on the cutting edge of what we call this progressive penology, this new way of thinking about rehabilitating prisoners. So the honor camp first appeared in Colorado and other states quickly followed. and Tucson is exactly one of these kinds of honor camps that would only take federal prisoners who had trustee level status, who had short prison sentences. And this is the timeline of the prison and of the highway. The prison really was just a series of tents in 1933. By 1939, it was the camp that has the foundations that you can see in some of the archaeological remains. You can see if you go up to the Catalina Federal Honor Camp site. And then, of course, during World War II, that's the era when prisoners of conscience, draft resistors, conscientious objectors were imprisoned at the site. And by 1999 and to the present, this became a site that's renamed and honored in honor of Gordon Hirabayashi, the most well-known conscientious objector from World War II. And like I said, of course, you can go and see some of the remnants of those particular people who built the highway. Their legacy lives on both in the archaeological remains at the site, as well as in the historical legacy of their lives. So first I want to talk about draft resistors in general. World War II is not a war that's often associated with draft resistors. We don't think of people resisting the draft during World War II. I think we often think of the Vietnam War, maybe even World War I. But there were draft resistors during World War II of various kinds. There were conscientious objectors, there were the Quakers, and there were also Jehovah's Witnesses who refused based on the concept that they were all ministers and that they should have minister deferments, but the courts didn't see it that way. So a couple of points, and actually I'll back up for a second. One thing that's kind of interesting about Tucson that makes it stand out historically is Tucson was not a segregated prison in 1939. It housed a lot of different inmates. Some of the inmates were people who had violated immigration laws. So these were immigrants from Mexico who came in without documentation and were picked up. They were bank robbers. They were people who had evaded taxes. And so there wasn't a clear white-black kind of racial divide that warranted, according to the camp administrators, segregation. It wasn't until 1939 that the Caucasian prisoners started arguing for segregation from the immigration violators from Mexico. They wanted separate living facilities and dining facilities. And they agitated so thoroughly and so successfully that the prison started to be segregated in 1939. When the various kinds of draft resistors came, there started to be even more conflicts. The Jehovah's Witnesses and conscientious objectors, oftentimes that were associated with the Fellowship of Reconciliation, had resisted the draft on completely different grounds, even though they were both sentenced for violating the same laws. And they didn't get along very well. And in fact, in one particular instance, it almost came to violence. On January 7th, 1944, around 9:15 p.m., Officer King Murphy heard some commotion coming from outside of one of the barracks. Two individuals had gotten into a fight with each other over a piece of glass that both claimed was theirs. And the disagreement started to escalate. Jehovah's Witnesses started pouring out of Barrack C to see what was going on. Two among the Jehovah's Witnesses were heard saying this was the time to end the conflict here and now. And the entire camp became tense. Some of the Jehovah's Witnesses from Barrack C stormed to the hospital to take their anger out on one inmate who they believed had been unfairly attacked. And in response, the orderly in the hospital locked the doors to prevent the escalating violence from continuing. Administrators at the prison realized that they had a problem on their hands, and so they started searching the barracks and the prisoners. And they found dozens and dozens of homemade knives and weapons. And they realized that they did have just about, they just narrowly averted a riot between these two groups. And so they went ahead and further segregated the camp, keeping the Jehovah's Witnesses in Barrack C and keeping the rest of the resistors separated, both in their living accommodations and in their eating accommodations. But the conscientious objectors were not happy with that. They were happy to be separated from the Jehovah's Witnesses, but they were really upset that the camp was racially segregated. And so they encouraged some of the African-American prisoners to protest. They were successful in supporting the protest of one individual, only known as Tully, who refused to eat, went on a hunger strike, trying to get the camp desegregated. He lost quite a lot of weight, drinking only water and working all the while he was on his hunger strike. The prison officials finally desegregated the mess hall, but not the living quarters, and that ended the hunger strike. So the superintendent started to get to know these prisoners of conscience as real troublemakers, and he really was not too pleased with them. Onto the scene then comes Gordon Hirabayashi. He's the first Japanese American who showed up to camp as a different kind of resistor of conscience in 1943. Gordon Hirabayashi's civil disobedience is some of the best known civil disobedience during World War II because he intended to challenge the entire program of Japanese American internment. It didn't quite work out that way, and I'll explain that a little bit more in a minute. But he was an idealistic young university student. He knew that the curfew placed on people of color, of Japanese Americans who were merely of Japanese descent, was probably unconstitutional, and he couldn't comply with that. And when it came to being evacuated and the forced evacuation and incarceration of all people of Japanese ancestry from the West Coast and the lower third of California, or of Arizona, he decided this was the time to turn this into a test case if he could. He lost in court, he lost all the way up to the Supreme Court, and in return had to serve a prison sentence. And I'll explain more about his story in a minute, but his resistance didn't come out of nowhere. He didn't just wake up one day deciding that he was going to challenge the constitutionality of a federal law. This is a book about his stand. It's written by him. It's an edited collection of his diaries and his writings and letters. So his parents immigrated to the United States. The second individual in the front from the left is his father. They immigrated in 1909. Shingo, like I said, is his father, second from the left. And they arrived with some of their classmates. They studied English, and both Gordon Hirabayashi's father and his mother converted to Christianity while they were studying in Japan. When they converted to Christianity, his parents did not join a denominational church. They joined a non-denominational church and became followers of Kanzo Uchimura, who founded the Mukyokai movement in Japan. And this was a movement meant to make Christianity more relatable culturally to Japanese Christians. Uchimura had studied theology at the Boston Seminary and brought an ideology of Christianity that included pacifism and the goal of oneness between belief and behavior. Gordon Hirabayashi said that he learned from his father that oneness between your beliefs and your actions laid the entire foundation of his later acts of conscience. He credited his parents for giving him that sense of responsibility to live a very thoughtful and deliberate life. Hirabayashi's father joined with others to create the White River Garden Corporation. When they built the White River Garden Corporation in Washington State, they did so under the shadow of the Alien Land Law that had become a part of Washington State's Constitution. In 1921, the state of Washington strengthened the Alien Land Law, which said that if you were an immigrant without the right of US citizenship, meaning someone who is neither white or of African descent, so Japanese immigrants, could not become US citizens, then you had no right not only to own property in the state of Washington, but it was also illegal for aliens to hold majority interests in agricultural lands. So the White River Garden had been created through a corporation, and 1,997 shares of the stock, the vast majority of the stocks, were given to Kutsunos, a partner of Gordon Hirabayashi's father's daughter, his Nisei daughter, Yoshiko. The corporation then was predominantly held by an American-born citizen, but because any of the stock was owned by immigrants ineligible for citizenship, the Washington Supreme Court ruled against the Hirabayashis and the other co-owners and took the land away. The families were allowed to continue to live on the farmland, but they had to rent it back from the state of Washington. This taught the Hirabayashis a strong lesson, especially the parents of Gordon Hirabayashi, that even citizenship would not protect you. When Gordon Hirabayashi decided to take his stand during World War II, he said that his mother was extremely distraught and said that his citizenship would not protect him. Gordon Hirabayashi believed, quite naively, that his citizenship would protect him. And so they had that difference of experience. This is a picture of Gordon Hirabayashi when he graduated from high school. After he graduated, he went and enrolled in the University of Washington, where he became an active member of the YMCA. He earned a fellowship to attend a leadership conference at Columbia University the summer of 1940. And to get there on a student budget, he hitchhiked. He hitchhiked there and he hitchhiked back. So this is a rare photo of him and his friend Jim Martin hitchhiking back from his leadership conference. When he went to this leadership conference, he became aware of things that he had never known about before, of isolationist and pacifist arguments against the United States getting involved in the growing conflicts in Europe and the Pacific. And it was that kind of consciousness raising that when he came back, supported his decision to become a Quaker. When Gordon Hirabayashi was a student at the University of Washington, he was not unfamiliar with conflicts over racism, with discrimination. This is a picture of him with what he calls on the back of the photo, the Social Problems Minority Group Advance. This was an effort to advance the rights of minorities and to fight injustice. But he was also a part of the YMCA and groups that were quite mixed ethnically and racially. And it was in this kind of context that he made his first decision to resist the curfew during World War II. Immediately after Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, the United States passed a curfew for all persons of Japanese ancestry to remain in their homes and to remain within a set number of miles near their homes between, and I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the times. I believe it was between 8 p.m. and 6 a.m., something like that. And so he was a college student, and one night, Gordon Hirabayashi said he remembers quite distinctly studying with his friends at the library and realizing that it was time for him to head home because of curfew. His friends were very helpful in reminding him and said, "Hey, Gordon, it's time to go home. It's almost curfew." So he headed home one night, and then halfway home realized, what am I doing? I am the only person in my entire friend group that has to leave, and just because I'm of Japanese ancestry. This has to be unconstitutional. This doesn't fit with my conscience. I can't comply. And so he turned around, went back to the library, and he said from then on, never obeyed curfew again. And he continued to observe what was happening as things started heating up and as restrictions started being added for people of Japanese ancestry in the Seattle area. After President Theodore Roosevelt signed, oh, sorry, did I say Theodore Roosevelt? Apologies, I'm Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Signed Executive Order 9066. And after the military set up zones of exclusion, it became clear that citizenship was not going to protect the Nisei. When the orders came out for all persons of Japanese ancestry, both alien and non-alien, meaning those who are immigrants without citizenship and those born in the United States with citizenship, that they were to report to assembly centers. Gordon Hirabayashi started helping the American Friends Service Committee and helping families relocate to these assembly centers. And he said the circumstances were so miserable as to really destroy a person's sense of dignity for themselves that he had to do something about it. So he decided to turn himself into the FBI and refuse. In his particular case, after it went up to the Supreme Court, it turned out that because the FBI found out that he had refused to comply with curfew and also turned himself out in an attempt to challenge the exclusion order, that he ended up being charged and sentenced for both of those crimes at the same time, meaning concurrent sentences. So by the time that his appeals went to the Supreme Court, they had 2 sentences and 2 concurrent convictions before them. And so they took the opportunity to only consider one of his convictions, and that was the curfew conviction. That was the easiest conviction for them to consider. And they decided in a unanimous vote to uphold his conviction, saying that it wasn't really too much to ask even citizens to follow curfew orders, even if those curfew orders were written on the basis of race alone. And so he went to Tucson, and I'll tell you a little bit about that in a second. This is a letter that gives you some of the background about why he decided to refuse to relocate and why he decided to take this case to the Supreme Court. He wrote this letter, and I'm going to read just a little bit of it to you. This is the letter he turned into the FBI. Over and above any man-made creed or law is the natural law of life, the right of human individuals to live and to creatively express themselves. No man was born with the right to limit that law, nor do I believe can anyone justifiably work himself to such a position. Down through the ages, we have had various individuals doing their bit to establish more securely these fundamental rights. They have tried to help society see the necessity of understanding those fundamental laws. Some have succeeded to the extent of having these natural laws recorded. Many have suffered unnatural deaths as a result of their convictions. Yet today, because of the efforts of some of these individuals, we have recorded in the laws of our nation certain rights for all men. And so he's comparing himself to some of these early resistors that risked their lives to make the country better and more just. Moving down, he said, this order for the mass evacuation of all persons of Japanese descent denies them the right to live. It forces thousands of energetic, law-abiding individuals to exist in a miserable psychological and horrible physical atmosphere. This order limits almost full extent the creative expressions of those subjected. It kills the desire for a higher life. Moving down a little bit further, let me add, however, that in refusing to register, I'm well aware of the excellent qualities of the Army and the government. Personnel connected with the prosecution of this exclusion order. They are men of the finest type. So even as he says that he cannot in good conscience follow the law, the people who are executing it are good men. When he lost his Supreme Court case, he was living in Spokane, Washington, working for the American Friends Service Committee, when 2 FBI agents picked him up and delivered him to the district attorney, Edward Conley's office, to begin what was then his 90-day sentence. The district attorney Conley informed Hirabayashi that because the original road camp that he had applied to be able to serve his sentence in was located in the exclusion zone, he would not be allowed to serve his time there, and that he would have to finish his sentence in the Spokane County Jail. He was completely distraught. He didn't want to spend any more time in what he called a walled institution. And so the DA said, well, there's another camp in Tucson, Arizona. but that's a long way away and we can't transport you there. Gordon Hirabayashi said, that's fine, I'll get myself there. And you saw the picture of him hitchhiking back from his New York adventure. He knew he could make it. And so with a little persuading, Gordon Hirabayashi set off on his way across several states to turn himself in for his sentence at the Tucson road camp. While he was traveling, he loves to tell this story that he was picked up by a highway patrolman in Utah who offered to give him a lift. And while they were riding, the patrolman asked Gordon, so where are you headed? And when he told him, he said he slammed on his brakes and had to learn more. Gordon Hirabayashi gave him his letters, showed him that it was legit. The patrolman still wasn't sure if he should take him into the station or if he should allow him to go on his way. And once again, Gordon Hirabayashi being quite persuasive and having all of the paperwork, he convinced the patrolman to take him to the end of his route and let him go on his way. That wasn't the end of his troubles though. When he got to the Tucson offices to turn himself in to be taken into custody, the officials there hadn't heard that he was on his way, had no idea that they were expecting a prisoner to turn himself in. And so they said, you're gonna have to go back home. Gordon Hirabayashi said, I'm not going back home. I just hitchhiked my entire way here. Why don't you take a look around? Here's some numbers. Here's the name of DA Conley. Why don't you make some calls? And they said, all right. So why don't you take yourself out to dinner and to a movie? It's hot. And then come back and we'll see what we can do for you. When Gordon Hirabayashi tells that story, he says he had no idea he was in the exclusion zone. He had no idea that he was freely roaming around Tucson in the very area where he was not allowed to be in violation of the very law that he was protesting. And there you can see the exclusion zone goes all the way down right through about a third of Phoenix, Arizona, putting Tucson squarely in the exclusion zone. When Gordon Hirabayashi arrived in prison, he was received by Hopi draft resistors. Hopi resistors were there already. They had an interesting individual story of their own. Those who were there were members of a, as they described it, secret religious order of Hopi priests who had taken a vow never to take up arms against another nation. And having done so in secrecy, they didn't even have the position to make their case in court. They just had to accept whatever sentence was given to them by refusing to comply with selective service. And so when Gordon Hirabayashi arrived there, he was welcomed by the Hopi resistors. And I'm sorry, I don't have a picture that demonstrates this at all. This is just a picture of one of the prison guards guarding some of the people working on the road. But what is really outstanding about this particular story is the Hopi resistors had their own little ramada that they had built up in the hillside just away from the prison camp because there were no fences, just painted rocks marking the perimeter. And they invited Gordon Hirabayashi up for tea. They kept calling him brother, and they said that both Japanese and Hopis came from a single related ancestry, that were both from the same place. And Gordon Hirabayashi said that they would ask him to say words in Japanese until they would hear a word that sounded similar to Hopi language and then say, see, there we are, we're brothers. They served him tea and washed his hair in soapweed. This is a ceremony normally reserved for marriages, and ceremoniously then, they welcomed Hirabayashi quite literally into their family, and they became friends for life after that. Gordon Hirabayashi, like other prisoners, was put to work working on the road, but he didn't like it very much. As soon as he found the opportunity, he applied to work in the kitchen. And as he said, if there's one good position to be in a prison, it's to be a cook or a baker who can make the pies and the breads and the sweets. Everyone will love you. So that was the job that he had for the majority of his time in Tucson. While he was in Tucson, he also associated with the conscientious objectors, and he learned a lot from them. He had many conversations with them. He had already been to the workshop in 1940 at Columbia University, where he learned some of the ideas that some of these individuals were acting on when they resisted the draft. And he said that his time was very inspired. When he left Tucson, he left even more committed to making sure that any of his actions in the future would be completely in line with his values. When he finished his sentence, he left with a brand new suit like prisoners got at the time upon release and a bus ticket. And once again, he traveled on the bus all by himself from Tucson through the eastern border of California, going through the exact exclusion zone from which he was barred by the whole policy of Japanese American internment. When he returned to Spokane, this is where he got to act on his new held belief that he needed to make sure that everything he did was in alignment with his conscience. This is something that is very, very infrequently told, if ever at all. Gordon Hirabayashi was sent this questionnaire, this form, that's become widely known as the loyalty questionnaire by his draft board. It's also known as Selective Service Form 304A. He was sent this as a part of the early process of processing him once again through the selective service and getting him ready to be drafted. When he looked at this form, he said, "This says Statement of United States Citizen of Japanese Ancestry." That means the only people receiving this form from the draft board are people of Japanese ancestry. And so if it's a race-based policy, he said, I cannot comply. This is a very different reason for turning the form back to the draft board. Mostly this form is known for famous questions at the end or infamous questions at the end, which ask Japanese Americans, citizens, if they were willing to serve in the military service wherever ordered, and if they were willing to swear allegiance to the United States and forswear allegiance to Japan. Immigrants from Japan were asked slightly different questions. If they were willing to serve in the WAC, wherever ordered, and if they would forswear allegiance to the Emperor of Japan. Those questions were eventually modified, but this caused all kinds of chaos and unrest in the camps. Citizens weren't sure why they were being asked to serve in the military if they were being held without due process in camps without the right of release. And they weren't sure as citizens why they were being asked to forswear allegiance to the Emperor of Japan that they held no allegiance to. Immigrants from Japan were equally concerned about questions that had anything to do with any form of military service because they were either elderly or women. And they also were equally concerned that not having the right to become US citizens barred racially from becoming US citizens, that they were being asked to forswear the only allegiance, the only citizenship that they had the right to possess. And so this form alone has become infamous in the history of Japanese American history during World War II. And it caused some people to start questioning whether they could comply with any of the orders of the United States government. It caused some people to renounce their citizenship. But in the case of Gordon Hirabayashi, it led to the beginning of his draft resistance. When he returned it to the draft board decided they didn't care if he didn't fill it out. They were going to order him to show up for a pre-induction physical. This didn't make any sense for Gordon Hirabayashi. He was a Quaker. He never should have been processed for the draft. And he said, I just can't comply with any of this. And so he was picked up. He was charged with selective service violations, and he decided to represent himself in court. As a result, he earned himself a 1-year sentence at McNeil Island, where he continued to protest. He protested racial segregation in McNeil Island prison. And ironically, even though this individual, even though Gordon Hirabayashi was there for draft resistance, he never met the rest of the Japanese American draft resistors that were also at McNeil Island. This picture is of draft resistors on the day they were released, who are from Heart Mountain, Wyoming. So going back and thinking about the rest of the resistors that I wanted to tell you about, who were self-named the Tucsonians, They came later. They arrived in Tucson a year later. And they came from camps in Topaz, Utah, Granada, or otherwise known as Amache, Colorado, and Poston, Arizona. These are pictures of Topaz, Utah, and Amache, Colorado. When a year after the loyalty questionnaire was distributed that caused so much unrest, and individuals were recruited to volunteer for the segregated 442. The following year, in order to fill the ranks of the 442, which had suffered massive casualties being put in the riskiest missions and on the front lines, the draft was implemented to replenish their ranks. And this was too much for some people. Some people who were a little bit upset by the loyalty questionnaire decided that when the draft was implemented, it was time to do something about it and to resist. When the marshal came to pick up Ken Yoshida from Topaz, he asked Ken, "Is it always this bad?" referring to the dust and the heat and the horrible conditions of camp. And when Ken said it was, he said, "I don't blame you," referring to the fact that he didn't blame him for resisting the draft. The group from Amache was larger. Ken was the very first and one of only a handful of resistors from Topaz, but the group from Amache was much larger. And they really hoped to make their case a test case. They pooled their money, they hired an attorney, and they argued their cases individually. One really notable individual that resisted the draft from Amache and ended up going to Tucson was Yoshi Kubo. Yoshi Kubo, his parents had purchased some property when he was young, and he owned his own farm in Turlock, California. He was a farmer, he was a landowner, he was a US citizen. And when the draft became imposed on Japanese Americans, he said, "I'm a farmer. If I'm trusted enough to serve in the US military, then I should be given an agricultural deferment to go work my farm and to contribute to the war effort that way." He made that argument. The judge wouldn't allow him actually to make that full argument in court. The judge got upset that he tried to make an argument for something other than whether or not he appeared for his pre-induction physical. He gave instructions to the jury not to listen. But Yoshi was only given a 6-month sentence as opposed to the 9 or 12-month sentence that some of his peers received. The group from Amache, because they were so large, didn't get to hitchhike or have that kind of freedom of travel that Gordon Hirabayashi had. They were chained together on a train and transported that way. One thing that's really notable about the individual stories about Tucson is that the conditions both in the internment camps and especially in the county jails were so terrible that they called Tucson summer camp. But that doesn't mean it wasn't without its labor. This is meant to be a humorous cartoon, but it's the best one I could find that described what one of the resistors, Joe Norikane, talked about. He said, "I thought it was only in cartoons that prisoners busted rocks until I got to Tucson, and then I found out that was my job." They weren't put in striped pajamas and they weren't chained together, but they did have to bust rocks. Yoshi Kubo, having made his best effort to argue his case on the grounds of being a citizen landowner, became depressed in Tucson. His entries in his diary got shorter and shorter. Hard day, rain, hard day it was. Things got a little bit better after he was given the job of driving a bulldozer. But on his final entry, the last day before he was released, March 15th, 1945, his entry reads, "Application for expatriation, Consul General, San Francisco. And for renunciation, Edward J. Ennis, Justice Department, Alien Control Unit, Washington, D.C. He decided that he had given up on his citizenship if it was worth that little, and that he would renounce his citizenship and apply for expatriation. He didn't find out until years later, decades later, until the 1960s, that nobody had received his application for expatriation and for renunciation of his citizenship, or at least they hadn't processed it properly. So when he appealed and tried to get his citizenship back, he was met with a letter that said, It takes more than sending a letter renouncing your citizenship. We have to accept it, and yours wasn't accepted. You never lost your citizenship. Building the highway took more than just busting rocks by hand. It took massive efforts, heavy equipment, and explosives. One of the resistors, Ken Yoshida, learned some really valuable skills while he was at Tucson. He became a part of the blasting crew. He was very interested in engineering. And so as he set the blasts and observed how they worked, he came up with this idea that if two sets of charges were lined up at once, much more material could be loosened and the work could be much more efficient. And as he said, he got a lot more breaks after they started blasting rocks that way. Prisoners also had time for free time. They played ball. They played softball against a team from the University of Arizona. They played mahjong. They had other kinds of competition, even gymnastics kinds of competitions. And they also produced a newspaper called the Roadrunner and wrote articles. And when they left, they continued to consider themselves a family. Like Gordon Hirabayashi, they were transformed by their experience in Tucson. They came to see themselves as being a family of resistors. When Yoshi Kubo went home, he didn't talk much about his resistance, but when others went home, especially to that town of Turlock, California, they were ostracized within their own communities. In fact, some who owned property and who thought that after the war they were going to be able to go back to their farms, they were told that they were no longer welcome within their own Japanese American communities, that they had disgraced Japanese Americans and it was time for them to leave. And so Sus Yanokido in particular had to go find another farm to farm someplace else and was displaced yet again. So the story of the draft resistors is much more than just the original story of Japanese American internment and dislocation the first time. It was continued dislocation and ostracization. But they found family and belonging in their family of resistors. So this is them at their very first reunion in 1947, the same year that they were pardoned by President Truman. He had a commission study all of the thousands of individuals who had resisted the draft during World War II and determined that some of them were justified. And those who were Japanese Americans had a strong moral case. And under the conditions, the commission studying their particular cases recommended that they be pardoned. This is their third reunion. When you start seeing wives and children, the children of the resistors said, you know, our parents never talked much about their wartime experiences, and my dad never told me about him being a resistor. I guess we just kind of figured it out because we kept having reunions and gatherings with all these guys, and eventually we figured out who they were and what had happened. This is a picture of the 15th anniversary, and this is when a couple of the Hopi resistors joined them for their reunion. They continue to be lifelong friends based on their common bond and their common experience, and the Hopis believed that they had something a little bit more in common than just their draft resistance. And then this is just a handful of the last draft resistors, the Tucsonians, who are still living in 1999. They were invited by Mary Farrell and others who had organized the renaming of the campsite for Gordon Hirabayashi. And this is when I got an opportunity to interview them and to include them in the research to tell the story behind the camp. This is a picture of Joe Norikane's diary taken a couple of years after I first met him. And this is on the evening right before the Japanese American Citizens League had organized a ceremony to recognize those who had resisted the draft during World War II and to recognize them for taking a stand based on their conscience, not based on disloyalty. This was an opportunity for the Japanese American community to apologize to those who they had ostracized during the war and to recognize them for taking a principled stand. In Joe Norikane's diary, he talked about his own experiences as a young man. And he didn't talk a lot about the draft either, but when he was interviewed, he said, you know, I never really thought that we were going to win our case at the time, but I thought maybe if I leave a footprint in the sand of time, maybe someday somebody will be curious and will look back and wonder what it is that I did. And then maybe someday they'll understand. Well, he was lucky enough to find that day while he was still living, that people did understand and wanted to remember him. And so, of course, this is the picture of the Gordon Hirabayashi Recreation Site Interpretive Kiosk that tells not only his story, but also Gordon Hirabayashi's story and the story of the other resistors. So thank you so much. It's a pleasure to share these stories with you. I would